Hello, welcome to Geeking Out with Shad. Today I'm going to talk about the three basic languages that are needed to display something on a web page and then allow you to do something with it. I'm going to keep it super basic for this video. I just want to put something on a page, make it look how I want it to look, and then I want to make it interactive. Those are the three main things that I want to do. And these three languages that are used is the structure of a web page is taken care of by HTML. It's a markup language. Hypertext markup language is what HTML stands for. And then to make it look the way that I want it to look, and add in like the amount of spacing and things, because HTML will just go in order across the page and not have any spacing or anything like that. So I need a language called CSS, Cascading Style Sheets, and what that does is allows me to manipulate the HTML to kind of look and be positioned how I want it to be positioned and stuff. So I'll talk about those two and how they work together. Those two alone can create a pretty awesome looking like web page, but it would be totally static. There's a third language, and this is the brains behind web pages. It's called JavaScript. Not to be confused with Java, but people, just because the word Java is, there's actually very little relation between the two, except for if you go way back in the very beginnings, but they're completely separate from each other. JavaScript is a pure like programming language that you can use to work with your web page to make it more interactive, make it do things when the user does certain things. So let's get into it. I'll talk about these three and how they work together. I'm going to keep this super basic. What this is for somebody brand new that wants to either decide whether they want to get into this as something they want to do either just personally as their own projects or do it professionally someday. This is the base groundwork of understanding of how a web page works. And there's definitely many layers over it and way more advanced things. I rarely develop this way anymore. I work with React, which is a framework, a massive library of pre-made things that can do all these things. Very different the way that we do web application development today compared to how we used to do it. But I do feel it's important that most people, even if they're going to dive into doing frameworks like React or Angular or Vue or something, that they understand what is the basics of a web page and how it works. And then once you're there, then when you dive into these other things, it will help you kind of understand what's really going on. So let's get into it. I'll talk about these three basic things. Okay, so here we are in CodePen. This is just a tool that runs in the browser. It's pretty cool. Allows you to have these three main languages that I just talked about. So HTML, hypertext markup language, CSS, cascading style sheets, JS, JavaScript. Structure, how it looks, style, and brains. That's the way I look at these three things. Down here in this big white area is the display. So let's do what all tutorials love to do. Let's just do a hello world program. So we're going to start out by creating a div. A div is the most basic container in HTML. And then we're just going to type hello world. Now what's kind of cool about CodePen is as I'm changing code, every time I make a code change, it updates the display. So you'll see that hello world is now displayed here. So the first thing that I think right off the bat is this is way over here in the far left corner and it doesn't look very good, right? So we have our structure. We have a container with text inside of it. That's what HTML does. Over here, we can monkey around with this and change it and make it look a little bit better. So let's do that. The first thing we want to do is let's just center hello world on the display here. So I'm going to use what's called a selector in CSS. And I'm just going to do a regular tag selector. So div is called a tag in HTML. We also call these elements. Generally, once we get over here in the JavaScript world, you'll hear the term elements. So elements, tags, whatever you want to call it. We're going to use div tag selector. And then we want to align the text center. Notice how this is plain English, which is kind of cool. Text align center. And there you go. So what's happening here is this selector is selecting the div in this page and then doing something with it. And that's super cool because CSS allows us to have control of how our structure page looks. So that's, in a nutshell, the super basics of the difference between HTML and CSS, and what CSS does. But we want to get a little bit fancier than this. So this is a hello world, but let's just pretend we're going to be building a web page here, and you want to have a title for your web page, right? A header, a title, whatever you want to call it. We're going to call this My Awesome Web Page. Cool. But now it's like small text. It's centered in the page, which is great, but it's this tiny amount of text. Well, let's make the text a little bigger. And wow, there we go. Now it's like My Awesome Web Page right there. So cool. Now I want to add more content to my site. So I want to add some text underneath here, maybe an introduction. So welcome to my new web page. I am learning how to write code. Now this does not look very good. Like, what is going on here? This is like the same size as my heading. You can't differentiate the two, and so on and so forth. So this is the power of CSS. And it's also how we want to choose our tags or our elements a little more wisely when we're building out a page. So HTML has many tags, and they all have different purposes. So down in the description, I will put a reference to HTML tags and what they all do. They all have different purposes. So but for this tutorial, I'll just put some in here and clean this up a little bit. First of all, this div up here, that's my heading for the page, so I should use a tag that's appropriate for a heading. So in HTML, they have tags for headings. They're called H tags, and there's H1 through 6, I believe. All right, now notice that this text is no longer following what I have defined here. Well, that's because I changed the name of it, and the selector no longer matches to H1. Another thing to notice is that it's no longer 50 pixels, but it's not the super tiny original text that we had when we first wrote Hello World. Remember how small it was? This is a little bit bigger because H tags have some default kind of properties to them on how they should look. And I'll show you. I'm going to put in H2 in here, notice how that gets a little smaller, right? And H3, smaller yet. And so that's why there's H1 through 6s. They all have some different default properties. H1 or H6, super tiny, even smaller than the default text, right? But since this is the main heading for our page, we want it to be H1, right? Now we want this selector to match this tag. So we're going to go and type H1 here. And now all of a sudden this formatting that I initially put in there targets this container, the H1 element. But then notice how this suddenly went back to just the basic default. So CSS allows us to control and decide what we want this to do over here. I could go and do this and say text align center and move this to the middle. Now it's looking a little bit better, right? But one of the things is if I ever put another div in here that to do something else, now this selector is going to target all of the divs on my page, and maybe I'll make other divs that I don't want to follow this formatting. So how I specify this div is I want to give it some type of identifier that's specific to what it is. So I'm going to call this my main site content. And so I'm going to add a class of content. This allows me to use a class selector over here to target that content. Notice how it's still working because this is called a div, right? So what I want to do now, though, to make it more specific is I want to call it content. And by putting a dot in front of it, that tells me it's a class. There's different prefixes to these. So nothing, you're targeting a tag. Dot, you're targeting a class. There's another thing called an ID where you'd put a hashtag and that would target an ID within your div. By the way, these things inside of a HTML tag are called attributes. So class is an attribute, and there's, again, a whole bunch of different types of attributes that you can put right inside of your HTML tag. So now I'm starting to make this look a little better. One thing I want to do is I want to make the font something a little prettier. Prettier is definitely not the same to everybody, but I tend to like Arial. It's a very common, clean font for web pages. So we're just gonna clean that up a little bit. But also, what if I want the background of this to be a different color, because that is the heading of my page. So I'm gonna add a background color, and we're just gonna make it a light gray using hex. Cool, now it's starting to look a little better. But wait, my text is bumped right up near the edge there, so I want to clean that up a little bit and just add some padding in there, just to make it look even more like a heading. So suddenly you can see how CSS is really making this structure over here look a lot better, right? So this is as far as I'm gonna take it. Well, one thing I don't like is I don't like this big white space up here, so I can also H tags come with, like I said, they have their own properties. They come with a higher margin on the top. So I want to override that, and I'm going to do margin top 0 and just let the natural page margin take over. That little space around there is the default of the page. So Now it looks pretty cool. It's starting to look like a web page with a header, and then here's some content. So that's as far as I'm going to take this part between CSS and HTML. I want to jump into JavaScript. So what's the role of JavaScript here? So let's do that next. Okay, so let's get into what JavaScript is all about. So we have our awesome web page right here. Let's try to do something. We want to interact with this page. So kind of like, well, what do we want to do? Well, this right here isn't really the truth, right? Not for me. I'm not learning how to write code. So let's fix that. We're going to create a button, and I'm going to put this button inside of a div, and I'll tell you why in a moment here. We're going to call it the tell the truth button. Right? So notice again, this button is way over here and it's not in alignment with everything else, and we don't want that. So let's add a class to this and call it action, something like that. You know, you can really name it what you want. And then down here we want to create a selector. So this is stuff we've already learned, and we want to align it in the middle. And suddenly you'll see the button here. Oh wow, that thing's like pushed right up against my text. Oh, that's terrible. Well, let's fix that. We could do that two ways. We could throw padding around it, but it doesn't really make sense to throw padding around the button. So let's just do a margin top for now of like, let's just say 15 pixels. You know, cool. Now I just pushed the button down. So kind of back to what we were talking about, you can see how I can easily start manipulating how this lays out using CSS. But that's not what we want to do right now. We want to do something, we want to tell the truth, right? So let's create a function over here. So remember, this is the brains of a website, right? So we want to say change content, right? So that's a function. This is basically how a function looks, right? Now we can also use, I'm going to drag this down a little bit so we can see all of our CSS, and we're not going to take up all this white space, so let's just make it a little more roomy here. I want this function to change the content, the stuff in this container. So this is where I talk about the next kind of level of things. When you use all these tags inside of a web page, they're actually creating a document object model. It's called the DOM. JavaScript understands objects, so we need the HTML to be converted to objects, and that is done through the DOM, this document object model. So as you build out a web page, you don't know it, but within here there's all this like capability to access these different things. Part of that is already being done here in CSS. We're using selectors to specify what part in this document object model we want to manipulate or change, right? We can do the same thing in JavaScript. So we can, and what's cool about JavaScript is we can use the same selectors that we use in CSS to grab this object out of the document object model, right? The DOM. So this is why we say document, and then we want to do a query selector. So we're doing a query using selectors. There's different ways you can do it, but that's how I like to do it. And then I want to get this object out of the DOM, out of the HTML. And to do that, I want to do .content. So you'll see something similar here. In CSS, I use .content, and the things I do here will change only what's in here. And now in JavaScript, when I grab this and get the object, I now can manipulate it and change it. So we need to assign this something. This is the way I'm going to do it. You don't have to do it this way. You could just go directly to it, but we're going to call this the content piece, right? So now I have this div, this object, and it's something I can change. So I'm going to say content inner HTML, and that's just the way JavaScript will allow me to change anything that's within this container. And it can be HTML or text or whatever. All of that is what's in there. So inner HTML, and we want to change it to tell the truth. There we go. Now I'm telling the truth. So what this is going to do is it's going to change the text in here. When I click tell the truth, nothing happens. It's like, well, why? Well, we haven't tied together this action here, the button, to do anything with this yet. So we want to do that, and we do that by using events. And one of the events that's built into, these HTML tags have all these capabilities, and one of them is to be able to target events. One of them is a click event. So on click is the event we want to use here, because when I click the button, I want it to do something. Well, what do I want on click to do? Well, I want it to call change content. So I'm just going to copy that, because then I have a less of a chance of having a typo, and paste it in here. And now we suddenly, I want to kind of, well, maybe not. We suddenly can do something with this button. Here's what I want to do. Format this in a way so it just stays nice and clean and readable, because when stuff starts to wrap, it gets kind of hard to read. So now we have a button that has an event, an on-click event, and that on-click event is change content, and then we close that tag. So this is going to call this function. It's going to grab this content out of the DOM, up here, out of the DOM, and it's going to change the inner HTML inside of it. So let's see if it works. If I have a typo or some type of mistake, or I did something wrong, it won't work, but we're going to see if it works. This text up above here should change, because this is the text that's within this content div, right? So here we go. It worked. First try. I always love that. So now, I click the tell the truth button, and then the truth comes out. Actually, I have been doing this for many years. I am not just learning, right? So that is the role of JavaScript, is to help make your pages interactive. It's the brains, and this is just like the absolute basics of what JavaScript can do. JavaScript is a full-blown, it can get really complex programming language. Frameworks, entire frameworks are built with JavaScript. React comes to mind. I work with React all the time. There's other ones, Vue, there's Angular, things like that. Entire libraries of functionality, things like that. So JavaScript is extremely powerful, and is what makes web pages or web applications able to do so much. So the structure is over here in the HTML. How do we want that structure to look? How do we want it to be laid out is here in the CSS. What do we want it to do is over here, the brains. And so it's pretty cool. That's really all I want to touch on is just the super basics of what the three primary languages that the browser understands do: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So there you have it. The three basic languages that run in the browser. Some of you, if you are actually a front-end developer, sometimes they call it, a software engineer, and you're working with a framework like Vue, Angular, or the most popular one, React. If you're working with one of those, you're likely asking, well, where's any of that? Like, what is it? Well, the browser does not understand any of those languages. Even TypeScript, all that stuff, that is purely for the developers and to make our lives easier to make complex applications. When we build those pages or that code, it basically compiles everything into these three primary languages: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because that's all the browser understands. The browser does not understand JSX. JSX is this kind of templating language that React uses, things like that. The browser only understands HTML and only understands CSS and only understands JavaScript in its pure native form. So yes, React is super cool, and I'll probably do a demonstration on React at some point, but for now, for the most basic understanding of how a web page can be created, this is what I'm presenting here. And yes, it gets much more complex than this really quickly. The thing is if this intrigues you, if you're interested in this, and this is something that you kind of think is cool and you like it, and you have a pretty good knack for learning how to do it, by all means, it's a great career. It's definitely a direction that you should take because there's lots of jobs. It's definitely a way to make a better income than some other jobs out there with less like physical labor intensive things like that. It's a really good career. So hopefully this is helpful. If not, let me know. And if you have questions or you want to see more or anything, you definitely have to show me the interest, because if I don't see interest from people in this stuff, I kind of am like, well, why should I be doing these videos? It takes a lot of time for me to do them. So subscribe, hit the like button, all that stuff. YouTubers always say that stuff. The reason we say that is because we want to know that you like what we're doing, and then we'll continue doing it. But if we see that you're not interested, we're kind of like, I'm not even gonna bother. Why should I take my time to do this? So that's why you do those things. And then definitely comment, and ask questions, things like that. Generally, if you ask questions and stuff, I probably won't go and individually answer a whole bunch of things because I just don't have time for it. But what I would do is I read and I'm like, oh, okay, it'll help me improve and do another video like this that will help answer some of your questions. Sweet. I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Peace.